Torchbearers of History, a connected series of historical sketches, Volume 1, From the Earliest Times to the Reformation, by Amelia, Hutchinson, Stirling. Chapter 4. Alexander the Great, the Rise of Macedon. I have said that the Peloponnesian War brought about the downfall of Greece, and we are now going to see how this came to pass. Once on a time an old chief lay dying, and he gathered his sons round his deathbed to give them his parting advice. He pointed to a bundle of arrows tied together that lay at his side, and he bade his sons each try to bend or to break the arrows without untying the string, and they tried, but they could neither bend nor break the arrows. Then the dying chief bade them untie the bundle and break the arrows one by one. This the young men did with ease. "Now," said their father, "so long as you stand together, you shall be like a bundle of arrows. Your enemies shall not have the power to bend or break you. But so soon as you fall apart, remember that fate of the single arrows shall be yours. You shall be broken in fragments and scattered to the wind." At the time of the Peloponnesian War, the Greeks had forgotten the truth that is contained in this old story. Year by year, as they fought amongst themselves, the strength by which they had overthrown the hosts of Persia became weakened, men were killed, money was wasted. When the war ended, the people of Greece were no longer able to fight a foreign foe. Meantime, while Greece was becoming weaker and weaker, there was a country on the north of it which was growing stronger and stronger every day. The country was Macedon, of which Alexander the Great was king. Even before the time of Alexander, the Greeks had been conquered by a people of Macedon under Philip, the father of Alexander. When he was a boy, Philip had been carried away as a prisoner of war to the city of Thebes in Greece. And there he grew up and learned much which he would never have learned if he had been brought up at home in Macedon. Afterwards, when he was king of Macedon, he made use of all he had learned in Greece against the Greeks themselves. One thing he had learned was that the best way to weaken Greece was to make the different Greek states fight against each other. So he kept on stirring up jealousies amongst them until they were all at war with one another, and two of them begged Philip to come and help them to fight against the people of Athens and Thebes. Of course, that was just what he wanted. So he at once led a large army into Greece, and at a place called Charonia he completely defeated the Athenians and the Thebians. That was in the year 338 BC, a little more than 150 years after the glorious battle of Marathon. Greece never recovered from that defeat. It never was again the great country it had been before. Just as we may say that Marathon made Greece, so that we may say that Charonia ruined it. Alexander, the son of Philip, who was only 17 or 18 years of age, was present at the battle, and, young though he was, made proud the heart of his father by the courage with which he fought and the skill with which he led the troops entrusted to him. We are told that after the battle Philip embraced his son and said to him, "Go, my son, and seek another empire, for that which I leave to thee is not worthy of thee." Even before the battle, Alexander had often showed that he was by nature brave and full of daring. There is a story that a certain man had a horse which he wanted to sell to Philip, a fine, high-spirited animal, pure white, with black mark, like an ox's head, on its flank. But as none of his nobles could manage it when they tried, Philip ordered the man to take it away. Alexander, however, who was then a boy, begged that he might be allowed to mount the horse. and so well did he sit on it, and so cleverly did he manage it, that at last it became quite tame and gentle with him. So he kept the horse, and called it Bucephalus, ox's head, because of the mark on it. Afterwards, when he grew up to be a man, and led his army into distant lands, conquering all that came against him, he always had Bucephalus with him. And when at last the good horse died far away in India, his master built a town in his honor, and called it Bucephala. Alexander was not only a better horseman than most young men of his time, he was also a better scholar, and knew more about the learnings of the Greeks. When he was a lad, he was fortunate enough to be taught by a Greek philosopher, Aristotle, and from him he learned to understand and love the works of the great Greek writers. Above all, we are told, he loved the works of the poet Homer, and greatly admired his hero, swift-footed Achilles, whom he ever sought to imitate. It was when Alexander's father Philip died, scarcely 2 years after the Battle of Chaeronea, that the Greeks first discovered what an able soldier Alexander was. When they heard of the death of Philip, they thought that the time had come to make Greece independent from Macedon. For Alexander was still so young that they did not think he would be able to lead an army against them. So they rose up and fought against the Macedonians in Greece, and declared themselves free. But in a wonderfully short time Alexander arrived in Greece with his army, and soon showed that he was more than a match for the Greeks, who were weakened by their many wars amongst themselves, and who were soon glad to make peace with him. For some time after that, Alexander was employed fighting and conquering the wild tribes on the north of Macedon. But in 334 BC, he set out with a large army for Persia. First, he crossed the Hellespont, the strait separating Europe from Asia Minor, which is now called Dardanelles. When he reached the place where Troy had stood, he held games and feasts in honor of the Trojan War. Not long afterwards, a large army of Persians met him at the banks of the river Granicus, which is not very far from Troy, and tried to prevent him from advancing any further. But he completely defeated the army, and then marched southwards, conquering all who opposed him, and soon made himself master of the whole of Asia Minor. There was a story that in a town of Asia Minor, called Gordium, there was a chariot which had belonged to one of the old kings of the place, the yoke of which was tied to the pole by such a wonderful knot that no one could unfasten it, and it was believed that whoever could untie the knot would rule over all Asia. When Alexander saw the knot, he did not try to untie it, but it is said he simply cut it with his sword. So, nowadays, when anyone finds an easy way out of difficulty, we say he has cut the Gordian knot. When the king of Persia heard of Alexander's conquests, he assembled a great army and led it himself against the Macedonians. At Issus, at the entrance to Syria, the two armies met, and the Persians were utterly routed. Then Alexander marched through Syria and took of Tyre, after besieging it for several months. He next led his army into Egypt, where he founded a town which he called, from his own name, Alexandria. After remaining some time in Egypt, he again marched through Syria, crossed the river Euphrates and Tigris, and defeated the Persian army for the third time in the plain of Arabella. During the next few years, he laid waste to several Persian towns and conquered the chiefs of the neighboring tribes, one after the other. No one could stand against him. Never was a leader so successful. Some of the savage people actually began to think that he was not a man at all, but a god. And the brilliant young general himself, elated with all his wonderful triumphs, and with all the homage which he everywhere received, almost believed that the priests of Ammon had spoken truly. For it is said that when he was in Egypt, Alexander visited the temple of the Egyptian god Ammon, and the priests there declared him to be the Son of God. After he had conquered all the people of the west of the Indus, he resolved to cross that river and enter India. So in the year 327 BC, he led his army to the west bank of the Indus, where they cut down a forest to make ships, and then sailed across the river. Arrived on the east side of the river, he fought and conquered many Indian chiefs and founded many towns, one, as I said above, in honor of his horse, Bucephalus. Then, still unsatisfied with all the conquests he had made, he was eager to push forward to the great Indian river of the Ganges. But his men, heartily sick of fighting and of marching for miles under a scorching sun, began to grumble among themselves, and at last refused to go any further. So Alexander, sorely against his will, was obliged to turn back. On the march back, the way lay through the great desert that lies to the west of the Indus, and terrible were the hardships which the army suffered as they passed through it. More than half of the men perished from thirst or famine or exhaustion, and many were slain by the savage tribes who, from time to time, made sudden attacks upon them. When they reached Babylon, Alexander resolved to remain for some time in that city, and to make it the capital of his great empire, which now stretched from the Danube to the Indus. But he had not long been there when there was seized with a sudden illness, and died in a few days. That was in the year 323 BC, when he was only about 32 years of age. When we read the life of Alexander, we are apt to get tired of hearing of so many battles and conquests, but we must not forget that all these conquests really did good, even to the people who were conquered. For whenever Alexander went, he tried to spread Greek, learning the Greek civilization. There is a story told about him which I think is more pleasant to read than the history of all his great victories. It is said that once, when he was taken ill in Asia Minor, he received an anonymous letter telling him to beware of his doctor, who was called Philip, for that he had intended to poison him. Now Alexander trusted and believed in Philip, and his faith in him was not shaken in the least by this letter. So when Philip brought him a cup of medicine, he took it from him without a moment's hesitation, and drank it off. As he did so, he handed the letter to the good doctor, who, we can well believe, was much touched at this proof of the king's faith in him.